Finding the right point of view for your book is going to be one of the most important decisions that you make. So let's talk about in this video, how do you know which point of view is best for your book and how do you avoid the dreaded head hopping? Hi, I'm Charlotte Chipperfield. I am your book coach and developmental editor, and I help women authors unapologetically write, edit, and publish their books to inspire and create an impact. So when it comes to selecting a POV or point of view to tell your novel or to tell your story, it's really important to consider this because ultimately it's going to set the tone for your book and it's going to set the tone for your reader's experience. It's going to determine how much you bring the readers in really close to your characters or how much distance are you putting between the reader, the characters, and the story. So what is point of view? Point of view is really determining who is telling your story. Now, this might sound really obvious, but there's different perspectives and different ways in which we can tell a story. So it's ultimately what is the lens that the reader is experiencing. So this could be a single character, it could be multiple characters, it could be an all-knowing narrator. So really, your choice of point of view ultimately determines how close your readers are getting not only to your characters, but to their thoughts and some of the information that is presented around the action that is taking place in your book. So let's take a look at some of the most common points of view. So the first one is first person point of view. This is told from the perspective of one of your characters. So usually your protagonist, your main character, it is through their eyes. We get to, as the reader, sit and embody them and see the world through their eyes. We understand who they are, their beliefs, why they're taking certain actions. This is written using the words I and we. So this is where we really understand what I am experiencing as the reader, as the main character. So second person point of view is more the author speaking directly to the reader. So this is using a lot of you. So I encourage you to take these steps in order to understand point of view. This is not often seen in the fiction side of things. This is reserved a little bit more for the nonfiction world. So if you are writing a self-help book or a business book and you're giving people a 5-step method on how to accomplish something, make their lives better, grow their business, whatever that goal is, that's where second person can be really handy because you're talking directly to the reader and helping them do something. So then there's two different third person points of view to consider specifically for fiction. So the first one is that third person limited. So this is where your book is written by a narrator who only knows the thoughts and the feelings of one character. So this gives a little bit of distance between your character and the reader and their thoughts. The other is third person omniscient. So this is told by a narrator who knows everything about all of the characters. So again, this isn't just looking at one character, it's they are all knowing of all the characters, their thoughts, their beliefs, their actions, why they're doing what they're doing. So that's why choosing a point of view is so important for your book because ultimately you're deciding how close the reader is getting to your characters and how much they are going to know throughout the journey of your story. So ultimately, you want to select a point of view that's going to bring them closer, who's going to have that emotional resonance, maybe pull at their heartstrings, and not having them feel detached or confused or unsure of kind of who's speaking, whose perspective is being told, why you know certain information. So playing around with some of these perspectives can be super helpful. I know for myself, when I was setting out to write my novel, I took the first couple pages and I wrote one in first person and one in the third person. And really got a perspective shift of, okay, this is bringing us really close to this character, and that's not quite the experience that I wanted to create. And when I switched to third person, I was like, okay, this is how I want there to be just a touch of distance, but the narrator knows everything about this character. So have some fun and play around with these a little bit and just see, does your writing work better in first person or maybe third person? And does the narrator know just one character really well, or does it know all characters? So this can be a really fun exercise just to think about if you're trying to select which point of view is going to be best for your book. So there's also 4 other things to consider when you're choosing which point of view is going to be right for your story. So ask yourself some of these questions. So the first one is, whose story is this? That might sound really obvious, but ultimately identifying which character you want the reader, us, those of us reading your book, what do you want us to be most affected by? So this can be identified by understanding which characters are going to be most affected by the events of your story. So a first person or third person limited point of view might allow readers to experience the story through their eyes, where anything like omniscient or the second person is going to be very clunky and confusing and create that distance for the reader. So the second question to ask yourself is, how much intimacy do you want to create? And no, I don't just mean that kind of intimacy. Unless, of course, you're writing romance. So again, that first person is going to bring you really close to that character. It's going to be a very intimate relationship with that character. We're going to understand everything there is to know about them and watch them go on this journey and how they grow and expand throughout the plot that you are creating for them. And so third person can also do that. There's just a slight distance in between. So that third person limited is where we're going to get just a little bit of distance, but we're still going to really understand that one character. Versus the third person omniscient, which is kind of understanding all of the characters, which you can imagine is going to create even more distance just between how much we know. We might know more information, but we're not necessarily feeling that intimacy with just one character. So the third question to look at when determining your point of view is to really think about, what is the scope of your story? So if your story is spanning multiple locations and characters or generations, multiple perspectives, then third person omniscience gives you a little bit more flexibility to go and explore all of those different areas, where something like first person is going to be a little bit more restricted because ultimately we're really close to this one character and we're seeing, feeling, and experiencing the world only through that one character. So if you're really trying to create a very focused feel and have a very character-driven story, meaning the characters, their actions are driving that story forward and their decisions are driving the story forward versus necessarily just the plot, that's where first person or third person limited might be a really good match for your story. So consider again, how wide of a breadth does your story cover in location and perspectives, and see if, again, how intimate do you want to create this? Do we need to know everything about everyone in every location, or are we just trying to make it very specific to this one character, their experience as they move through your story? So the fourth question to ask yourself when choosing a point of view is to really think about what voice fits your story. So each point of view is going to bring its own flavor, and again, if you play around with this in writing the first couple pages of your book in different perspectives, you'll see this come through. So the first person creates a very deeply personal tone, where the third person omniscient offers more kind of traditional narrative feel. So ultimately you want to choose something that's going to align with your mood and the message of your story. So again, have fun with this, play around with it, play with your writing and see, what does it feel like to have this really intimate first person, or what is it with third person limited versus the omniscient, and kind of how much do you want the reader to know and experience, and that will help you determine which point of view is right for your book. Okay, so now that you've maybe have an idea of what point of view you're going to be writing from, here's the key, is to remain consistent throughout your book. And this can be incredibly challenging because I know different scenes, different writing stages, maybe you started with one point of view and now you're changing it, can be really hard. And so when we are switching point of views in our writing, usually by accident, it is called head hopping. So this might be where you're writing a scene and maybe it's in first person, so we're used to being from the perspective of the main character, but then all of a sudden there's a couple words that change and you're not sure who's talking or who just said that, and it sounds like it's a thought from another character. So that is head hopping. That's when we go from being in the main character and then we hop over to another character and we start to see what they're thinking. So head hopping actually breaks up your story. It also changes your point of view, so which creates confusion for the reader, and it doesn't allow the reader to continue to build that intimacy with the character. They actually get derailed from the story and start questioning, who said that? Why are they thinking this? How do I know this now? Why have we changed perspective? So this is why it's really important that once you choose a point of view, you want to stick with that and remain consistent. The exception to this, of course, is if you're writing multiple points of view in a book. And when you do that, you want to give a really clear indicator that the points of view have switched. So this is often done through new chapters with the different character names. So it's very clear that chapter 4 is now Anna's perspective. And then chapter 5 is going to be John's perspective. So this is where, again, you want to have a really clear indicator if you are writing a multiple point of view book. But if you're just sticking with one, it's really important that you stay with that one, and so that you're not switching between characters' perspectives and really unclear transitions. Okay, so an example of this I'm going to read is just a short sentence I put together. And it says, Lisa picked up the vase. Feeling a pang of regret as she remembered her grandmother across the room, Dan watched her, wondering if she'd ever tell him the truth. Well, a very intriguing sentence. Did you catch the point of view switch there? We actually start out in Lisa's perspective. So this is Lisa's story, and we're understanding her thoughts. But then it switches to Dan without any kind of warning, which ultimately results in a bit of confusion and just lack of that emotional connection to the story. So as readers, we can't know what's happening in Lisa and Dan's mind at the exact same time. So again, if you're writing multiple points of view, this is where having the different chapters, and maybe one would be Lisa, the other one would be Dan, and maybe we're seeing the perspective from the same scene from each of them, and that's how we would learn how each of them is thinking. But if you are writing this just as a one point of view story, so this would be Lisa's story, then we can't know what Dan is thinking. And that's what this sentence did. So that switched from her understanding and thinking about her grandmother, and then Dan is watching her and wondering if she's ever going to tell him her truth. Like, we can't know what Dan's wondering if we're in Lisa's head. So this is just one example of how head hopping can happen. And if it happens to you, don't worry. This is a very common mistake throughout writing for writers, especially if it's your first novel. This is very common, and it's okay. It's fixable. We got this. So here are some tips to help you avoid the head hopping. So the first one I think I've mentioned is to stick with that point of view per scene. So we want to make sure that you're consistent. Again, we don't want Dan's thoughts popping in when this is Lisa's story. And if you are telling the story from multiple perspectives, again, we want that chapter break or very clear delineation that we are switching from Lisa to Dan. So the second tip is to really use scenes and chapter breaks to help identify any switches. So again, make the switch clear with space and a visual marker. This could even be with asterisks, but it needs to be very clear whose perspective we're switching into and when. And the third is you want to make sure that you're really grounding the reader immediately. So this goes for any single point of view stories or multiple point of view stories. We need to be very clear at the very beginning of your book who's talking, whose head are we in, who's telling this story, and how close and intimate are we getting to this character, so that it sets the stage for your reader experience. So you can do this by orienting the reader by starting with the character's name, the location, and their immediate thoughts, so that we are dropped straight into their experience and straight into their story. So the fourth tip to avoid head hopping is to rely on external actions. So this is a really great way that instead of jumping from one person's head and their thoughts to the other one, is actually to use action to show what is happening with the characters. So this can be through showing their reactions and their body language and their actions. So it might just be, in this case with Lisa and Dan, maybe Dan was looking at her and he just lets out this huge sigh, right? So that's kind of this apathy, this, I don't know if she's ever going to tell me the truth. But again, Lisa can't know that's exactly what he's thinking, but she can pick up on his body language that shows he's a little bit disconnected or not engaged or lost in his own thoughts. So there's different ways that we can still demonstrate that Dan may be having some certain hesitations when it comes to Lisa. But again, we can't know exactly what he's thinking, but we can pick up on what Lisa thinks is going on with Dan. So finding the right point of view for your story can be really fun to play around with. So I invite you to experiment, decide what's going to work best for your story. And then once you've decided, you want to make sure that you are staying consistent as you write. So point of view is a very powerful tool that you get to select how close and intimate that reader experience is going to be and how much they're going to know about your characters and the world they operate in. So this is such a wonderful thing, and I think it's often a subtle nuance that writers make a decision about, and readers don't necessarily know the intent or the reason behind it, other than they're going to enjoy the story. Because our goal is to immerse our readers into this world and not create any confusion. We want to make sure they have a very seamless experience. So I'd love to know, what point of view are you landing on for your book? Let me know below in the comments. And of course, if you like this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel. Not only does that help my content rise to the top, but you'll also ensure that you never miss a video. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time.